thank you for coming along. My name's Sylvie. I'm MyHR's Chief Evangelist, as you will know if you've seen any of our content before. And today we're talking about managing a disciplinary process. So a really good session if you're an HR practitioner who wants to brush up on running a disciplinary. Perhaps you're a business owner or a manager who is thinking about maybe having to start some more formal work or more formal conversations with your staff about their performance or their behaviour. This is the best place for you to be today on this lovely, in Auckland, very, very rainy and then sunny kind of afternoon. We're having some spring showers come through or some winter showers. So a bit of housekeeping as usual before we kick off. The first thing to note is that the session is being recorded. So when you're asking questions or if we're discussing anything here, just remember it will be available on the public record later. And so if you want to ask a question, just make sure that's anonymous. But if you do need to duck out, take a phone call, if you have to duck away for whatever reason, you will be able to access the recording later to make sure that you don't miss anything. Slides will be available afterwards. You're welcome to take notes. That's always very heartwarming for me, but the material will be shared with you later. And please keep today's discussions confidential. So there are some examples I'll be using, which of course I will be anonymizing, but do come from real life situations. And then if we do have questions towards the end that I'm answering and responding to, these are real life situations that people are grappling with. So a bit of care, a bit of confidentiality. If any of this ends up on LinkedIn or Instagram or TikTok, I will have a conversation with you later. So none of that would be wonderful. Questions are very welcome. I do always say that these sessions really come alive when there's a lot of engagement. It helps me understand what you might be dealing with. I can tailor my examples accordingly. So if you do have a question either now or partway through or towards the end, just pop it in the Q&A function and I will answer them all together at the end of the presentation in case I've answered it on the way through. Let's kick off with a bit of an icebreaker. So I would love to hear from you what you're hoping to get out of this session, as well as your name and location. The reason I ask is, one, it's a tactic to get you engaging early, so hopefully get more questions towards the end. So I am being a bit underhanded here, but it also helps me understand the questions that you might have along the way. I can tailor examples. I can be more particular with whether I spend more time or less time on. So if you'd like to just let me know your name, location, and what you're hoping to get out of today's session, I'll come back to this in a second once I've talked through who we are and why we're running this session, and then we can I'll run through some of the questions and comments. So who's MyHR? Why are we here speaking with you today? So we're a New Zealand business that was established in 2013 to make HR easy. Our co-founders came from the corporate world of HR and from the small business world, and they thought there was an opportunity to deliver HR services and support for small and medium businesses in a way that hadn't been done before. So we're outsourced HR covering all employment matters, whether that's the proactive stuff around performance reviews and onboarding and remuneration and development, all the way through to what I like to think of as the pointy end of HR. So we're talking terminations and disciplinaries like we will be today, trial period terminations, misconduct, complaints and investigations, personal grievances, all that kind of stuff. There's nothing that we don't touch. The way that we deliver our services is a bit different. So we have a smart HR platform. So it's a software that you log in online, powered by HR experts. What this means is you get the benefit of having a platform, so a one source of truth for your business. It's where your employee data is stored, where their records are kept, where you run all of your processes online, like onboarding and performance reviews. But we're not just giving you the keys to a car and not teaching you how to drive it. There is a team of HR people in the background who act as your outsourced HR department. So you might call up one day with a question about managing payments for public holidays and you'll talk to Lisa, who's in our advisory team. You might call up another day with a question around one of the employment agreements we've sent back to you and deal with Siri and her team. So you have a team of people here writing documents for you, able to answer questions, guiding you through processes, which is where the real magic of combining the tech and the people comes in for us. At the moment, we support over 1,400 New Zealand and Australian businesses, which is pretty cool. We've got offices in Auckland, where I am today. Then we're down in Ōtautahi in Christchurch, and we've also got a team in Sydney. And as of the 1st of April this year, we have an office in Vancouver in Canada, which is very exciting. So we're in 3 different zones. We have Canadian HR run out of Canada. We've got Australian HR run out of Australia. So we have a team that's really experienced and is available to help no matter where your business or where you are located. What's also unique about us is because we've got businesses ranging from 1 employee through to 750 employees, that's sort of the range of businesses we support. We cover all industries and all territories. So we've got manufacturing, professional services, hospitality and accommodation. We've got trades, we've got import and export businesses. There's not a lot that we haven't seen and not a lot that we haven't supported our clients to manage. Unlike if you were an HR person who only had ever worked in banks, or an HR person who had only ever worked in sort of smaller run family businesses, because we have the breadth of experience in our team that we do and the breadth of our client base, we're really well positioned to help with whatever quirky or weird issue comes up, as well as helping you find creative ways to deal with what might feel like intractable or sometimes challenging people circumstances. Last point I'll add here is that we're a really cost-effective offer. We don't have any lock-in contracts. The onus is on us to provide you with an amazing service. For businesses of under 10 employees, it starts at $295 a month with access to everything I've spoken about so far. So the platform and the people support and the service that you get from us. And again, if you're not having a good time, then we don't force you to stay. We don't lock you into a term. So having rattled through that really quickly and kept my sales and marketing colleagues happy, I'll jump into a couple of our icebreakers and see who's come along today and what it is that we have going on. So we've got Natalie from Auckland. Kia ora, Natalie. Thank you for coming along. Amelia, welcome. What a lovely name. Is hoping to hear examples of this process and best practice as well. Glenda is keen to understand how long you have to leave between each step in the process. That's a good question, Glenda. We'll cover that off. Jenny from Auckland wanting to confirm she's up to date on requirements and processes. Jono, Sonia and Rachel, fabulous, love all of this. We have Olivia from Wellington, kia ora Olivia, who's new to an HR advisor role, looking to understand these processes better than she already does because she was previously working as a manager, and a few more. Fantastic. So thanks everyone for your comments. Really appreciate the time you've taken to send those through. I'm really confident we'll cover off everything that's been mentioned so far. And again, if there's anything I don't speak to, you're welcome to pop it in the Q&A and we can deal with it towards the end. So let's get going then. I'll jump back into our preso. So what we'll cover off today starts with talking about grounds for considering a disciplinary. What are the behaviours or performance issues that we're talking about when we talk about running a disciplinary process? We'll then cover off other ways you can manage those issues before you get to a disciplinary. Sometimes when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but a disciplinary isn't always the best tool to deal with everything you're seeing. And then we'll jump straight into the legal stuff. So what do you need to know? How do we run a disciplinary process? What prep do you need to do to go through the steps? We'll talk about notifying your employee, managing their response, and then confirming an outcome. I'll talk us through some examples and common mistakes that we see in our work here. I'll end by talking a little bit about the bonus resources that you'll get after the webinar. And then, of course, we should have plenty of time for questions. So we're at 1:10 at the moment. I'm aiming to be done at about 1:45 or 10:10, which will leave 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I am able to stick around a little bit longer for some questions as well if I don't get to everything. So please don't be shy, throw them in. And if I can't get to them on the call, I'll commit to following up with you later and making sure I can answer it for you. So let's dive in. Now, what I wanted to do first was lay out some of the examples of behaviour that is not okay at work and therefore warrants a response from the manager or employer. We can spend a lot of time talking about what drives poor performance or what drives misconduct or serious misconduct, but the purpose of today's session isn't to analyse and understand why people behave the way they do. It's about choosing how to respond when we have a behavioural issue or a performance issue we need to address. So performance concerns are anything where the employee is failing to consistently deliver what's required of them or what's expected of them in the role. Examples include not hitting sales targets. This tends to be one of the more black and white examples. Either you did hit your quota or you didn't. Poor or sloppy communication with clients, not getting enough work done. But perhaps you have a really someone who's a real perfectionist and works very high quality, but works slowly, and that can be an issue. Or not getting enough work done to the appropriate level of quality. Maybe you have someone who's really fast, but they're not very good at the details and they keep missing things. Missing deadlines is an example of poor performance. Getting justified complaints from customers. I mean, we know we've all had complaints from customers that tend to be a little bit spurious or a little bit pointed, but where there are justified complaints from customers about their experience with someone, that's totally something that you can respond to and address with your employee. I also want to make the point excuse me, that inconsistent performance is poor performance. Now, we can all have a bad day. You can be the most qualified nurse or the most qualified chef anywhere. You will make a mistake from time to time, and that's a feature of being human, and that's not poor performance. So I'm not talking about a one-off bad week or a bad day, or you got a poor night's sleep the night before, so you're not on top of your game for a particular meeting. But where you have someone's performance 1 month they're on the boil, next month they're off the boil, then they're really good for a couple of months and they fall off again for about 6 weeks and then they're amazing. They aren't meeting the appropriate standard of performance in the role. That accounts to poor performance. So if you have consistent inconsistency, I guess, or significant inconsistency, that amounts to poor performance. Someone doesn't have to be shit or rubbish all the time for that to be poor performance. If they're not consistent and they have moments where they're on and then when they're off again, that amounts to poor performance as well. We then move to misconduct. So with misconduct, we're talking about any behavior that undermines trust and confidence in the employment relationship. So this might be being repeatedly late to work. Being able to trust someone to show up on time is quite a key part of an employment relationship. Someone who's consistently rude to colleagues or customers, that's not really behavior that's acceptable in most workplaces. If they're consistently surly or they have a lot of apathy and you have to always kind of push them and nag them to get stuff done, they're not really taking the initiative to get work done that they're required to. If they're not following reasonable instructions or company policy, that's a misconduct issue. Passive aggression, just kind of being a bit of a dick in the workplace. Any of that kind of stuff is grouped around the theme of undermining your trust and confidence in them as an employee. So where there's an issue like that, we tend to call that misconduct. We can take them through a disciplinary process to manage that if it's appropriate. So don't feel like we can only discipline employees for black and white mistakes or black and white performance issues. How we show up to work and how we behave at work is as important to doing a good job as the results that we are achieving. There was sort of a growing movement towards talking about this a bit more explicitly in the 2000s. You might have heard of the no asshole rule, which is to say, it doesn't matter how amazing you are at your job, if you're an asshole, we don't want you in the workplace. There's lots of material on that side of things. But if someone is not showing up in a way that is appropriate, we can manage this through a disciplinary if we need to and if that's appropriate. So serious misconduct then is a step above misconduct. It's behavior that significantly undermines trust and confidence in the employment relationship. You tend to recognize it when you see it, so I don't think any of these examples will be surprising, but we're talking about things like serious or repeated failures to follow instructions, harassment, bullying, discrimination. Any of that kind of behavior tends to be quite serious. Fraud, stealing, whether you're taking cash out of the till or you're skimming off the top of invoices or you're putting yourself down as having worked an extra 15 minutes a day that you didn't actually work, any of that kind of stuff falls into that category. Dishonesty and lying absolutely strikes at the heart of the good faith relationship, even if it's about stuff that isn't necessarily that serious. But anything to do with dishonesty or being untruthful tends to fall into the serious misconduct category pretty quickly. Breaches of good faith is a very general term, but it's basically not behaving in a way that's showing up in good faith with your employer. So anything that sort of falls around anything that's to be dishonest, anything around not being sort of truthful or forthcoming with stuff, lying by omission, any of that kind of behavior, we'll tend to group into a breaches of good faith sort of label when we're talking about it and we're running a disciplinary process. There are other grounds which might trigger a disciplinary. I'm thinking about things like incompatibility is a very, very unusual example where for whatever reason, you've tried and tried and tried to get this person on board, but they're not compatible with your workplace, and so you decide to move them on for those reasons. But 98.99% of the time, your reasons for thinking about a disciplinary will fall into the poor performance bucket, the misconduct bucket, or the serious misconduct bucket. So how can we respond? Before we jump to disciplinary, let's think about the other tools we have at our disposal for managing performance or managing conduct concerns at work. So we start by talking about informal tools. The difference between informal and formal really is about tone and about process, and we'll get to the formal ones in a second. So informal responses might start with doing nothing. Now, doing nothing is not the same as ignoring something. Masterly inactivity is about doing nothing, monitoring the situation and stepping in if it doesn't improve. If you have an employee who is otherwise cheerful and productive and gets on well with everyone, if that had a really rough morning, they're a bit abrupt and snappy, and maybe the meeting that they ran wasn't to their normal standards of quality, you might not jump in with both feet and tell them off. If they're otherwise a really good worker, a good person at work, you might just keep an eye on the situation, check if it was a one-off, and if their behavior and mood improves over the following days and weeks, clearly they just had a one-off kind of bad morning, and we all have those, so we don't need to jump in. But it's just about going, I've noted this, I'm aware this is happening, and I'm going to wait to see if it continues or to get more information before I do something. The choice to do nothing can be quite hard, especially if you're used to being proactive and dynamic and not letting things slip and kind of picking things up as you need to. But all I want to point out is it's a perfectly legitimate choice to do nothing in the first instance because you don't yet have enough information to know if this is a pattern or an issue that needs to be addressed. The next thing you might do, and these are not in any particular order, but just as tools that you might use, is to get a bit more information about what's happening. So if you've seen a couple of these mornings where this previously cheerful, kind of collegial, happy to show up to work and do their job person is being a bit of a knob, you might need to check that you understand the situation and see if there isn't anything that you're missing. This might be a conversation with them to check in and see how they're going. It might be checking in with other members of the business to see if they're also observing this kind of snarky, unusual behavior. Maybe it's just directed at you, which is, good information to have. If you're the person they have a problem with, you might need to respond to that. But just getting a bit more information, looking into the customer's complaint, looking into the email trail that's been forwarded to you, get a bit more information before you decide to act so that you have all the information to hand and you don't have to backtrack because you've been a massive dickhead about how hard you've chosen to go in. Sometimes it's appropriate to give feedback. So this is just part of our day-to-day work experience, whether it's from us to our direct employees or us to our colleagues, sometimes us to our managers. Sometimes you just need to say to someone, hey, I really appreciate that you're putting agendas together for these meetings beforehand. Getting them 20 minutes before the meeting starts isn't very helpful because I don't have time to review and understand, the full scope of this meeting and what we're agreeing on. Next time, would you be able to send it to us a day ahead of time so I've got time to review it and kind of look through it? No one's in trouble. You're not telling anyone off. You're just saying this thing that you do, can you do it a bit differently so that you can make my life easier? So giving feedback is not a disciplinary process. It's just a part of being an adult at work, working with other humans. So when you are giving someone feedback, be thoughtful about it, be constructive, focus on what it is that you want done differently and explain why you want it done differently. Be clear about your reasons. Now, whether the situation is serious enough that you don't think these other tools are going to be helpful, or maybe you've tried to give someone feedback and it hasn't kind of resolved, you might want to jump into an informal discussion with them, which is to say, hey, I've asked for this thing to be different, and the last couple of meetings, I'm still getting the meeting agenda 20 minutes beforehand. This is causing me problems because it means that I'm unprepared with the information that my colleagues need from me at these meetings to make a choice. Is there anything that's stopping you from getting these to me a day ahead of time? Kind of what's going on with your process? Is there anything I need to be clearer about? So you're not, again, telling them off, but you are saying, hey, I've raised this with you a few times. I'm now kind of naming it as a problem. What's happening for you? What don't I understand? How can we resolve the situation? So I'm getting the information that I need and you can get things done on the back end. Now, again, we jump into the formal tools. So here is where we start documenting things or being clear about the process. Anything in this formal bucket, I would recommend you document and send a copy to your employee. Sometimes it's a legal requirement to do so, because now we're escalating the situation from just how do we better work together or how do we better solve these problems. Now we're saying there is a problem that needs addressing and we're formally naming it, and if it doesn't resolve, there might be further consequences down the line. So the first cab off the rank here is a formal discussion or a record of discussion is the terminology that we use. So this is where on a piece of paper or in an email or on a whiteboard, you are saying, I now have an issue with the fact that I'm not getting information ahead of these meetings in the time that I have it. Here is my understanding of the situation. Here is your understanding of the situation. What can we do next to resolve it, and what support, training or coaching do you need? And in our world, that tends to be a one-pager. It tends to be kind of a pretty quick turnaround time. You're not addressing 6 years of frustrations with them. That's not appropriate. But you are saying there's now a problem with whatever it is we're dealing with. What do we do next? And you're going to get a copy of this, and I'm going to get a copy of this, and a copy is going on your employee file. So if there is ever an issue in the future, we can come back to it and go, well, we did ask you to do this differently a couple of times, and we had a formal discussion about it. You were aware that there was a problem. A performance improvement plan tends to be where there has been a kind of consistent issue, usually to do with performance, not often to do with behavior, more about what it is that you're achieving. And this is the start of formal performance management. So we're documenting really clearly the outcomes we expect from this process, the timelines for improvement, what support we're going to provide you. That's usually for a period of between kind of 4 to 12 weeks, depending on the type of work that they do. And we're going to be catching up and holding you accountable for these outcomes, whether that's sending meeting notes a day beforehand, whether it's hitting your sales targets, whether it's responding to emails in a timely fashion, whether it's getting good feedback from customers about the service you're providing. We're going to be holding you accountable now. This is going to feel a bit uncomfortable because we're paying quite close attention to what you're achieving or what you're not achieving. And then we come to a disciplinary process. So the next 5 slides are about disciplinaries. I won't speak to them too much here. The point to take away from these couple of slides is really that we have plenty of tools to try and give feedback, address or correct behaviour or performance issues at work that don't result in punitive outcomes for the employee. We're just trying to improve things. We're assuming that this person is showing up wanting to do a good job and wanting to be a good colleague. So we're helping them get there by giving them clear feedback, clear guidelines and or clear outcomes along with some support or coaching. It's not punitive, no one's in trouble, we're just providing support. So before we jump into the disciplinary piece, a word on good faith. So good faith applies at all times to all of our employment relationships. And this is one of the guiding principles that we design processes and steps to meet the requirements of. So good faith is what we're trying to achieve, and our processes are designed to help us achieve that. So this is Section 4 of the Employment Relations Act, and good faith is important because it's Section 4. It's very early in the document. It comes straight after, how the Act was written and who's going to enforce it in the history of the document. It's the most important aspect of our legislative obligations or commitments to our staff when they work with us. And quoting from the Act, good faith is about not doing anything, whether that's directly or indirectly, to mislead or deceive, or that is likely to mislead or deceive. So that honesty, that importance piece clearly is coming through really strongly here. And it also puts a legal obligation on us to be active and constructive and responsive and communicative when it comes to dealing with each other. This applies to employees too, right? So this is a two-way obligation. But what I really want to draw your attention to is this piece around misleading or deception in terms of being really clear and transparent. And the second piece around being active and constructive and responsive, because it's really hard to have a good employment relationship if one of the parties is ignoring or not engaging with the other or being slow to engage, which is where some of the timings for some of this process comes in. So HR people tend to talk about good faith quite a lot. It's a very handy phrase to encapsulate a bunch of expectations like these ones here. What I want to draw your attention to is the fact that it is actually a legal obligation written into law that we have as employers, as employees too. So let's kick into our disciplinary process. Now, a disciplinary process is a formal consultation process with a person about concerns that you have about their performance or their behaviour at work. So it might result in a formal warning or a final written warning or dismissal. And dismissal might be with their notice period, so 2 weeks or 4 weeks, or without notice, depending on the circumstances. There's some really established case law from decades ago that says we cannot dismiss employees without, quote, a series of warnings, unquote, to do with the issue that we're managing. So although you can fire people in New Zealand, my HR runs between, at the moment, probably 40 to 45 disciplinaries a week. About 15 of those are for dismissal. So certainly you can fire people in New Zealand. The legislative framework that we operate in, though, says that we have to give them at least a series of warnings that this behaviour isn't acceptable, so that if it comes time to let them go or to terminate their employment, we've been really transparent, we've been clear, we've been constructive in signalling that this behaviour or this performance isn't acceptable, so that by the time it comes to termination, we've been really clear that this is a potential consequence, and we've given them as much of a heads up as possible for them to give them a chance to correct the behaviour or correct the performance. That's sort of the legal principles of why we have a series of warnings. What's important when running any kind of consultation process is that we have 2 things in place. The first is that we have substantive justification for what it is that we're doing. We have good reason for it, and we have been procedurally fair in how we've handled the issue. Now, substantive justification is the part that it's really easy to get right. So this is where we're checking to see if the employer has made a reasonable choice to do what it is that they wanted to do. Now, if you have someone consistently underperforming, if you have someone who has punched a colleague, if you have someone who's stealing from you, it is perfectly reasonable for you to go, that is not acceptable and I won't allow that in my business, and I'm going to respond in a way that might involve a warning or dismissal. That's reasonable. Where most successful personal grievance challenges come in is around the procedural fairness piece. It doesn't matter how obvious the problem is. If you have CCTV of them stealing $100 from your till, if you have 10 witnesses all videoing them punching a colleague, whatever the issue is, they still are entitled to fair process. Just like if I was going to draw an analogy with our criminal justice system, even if it's really obvious that you did something terrible or assaulted someone, you still are entitled to due process in the criminal system. You still are entitled to procedural fairness in the employment world, which is what our processes and our timeframes are designed to meet. So regardless of the reason for the disciplinary, in all circumstances, you must consult and the employee has certain rights. There's no such thing as instant dismissal in New Zealand. No one can be fired on the spot. So in all circumstances, there is a process to follow to make sure that we're meeting those employment rights. The first one is that employees have a right to know everything that may be material in the decision to give them a warning or dismiss them. If you've got a complaint from a customer, you must share that complaint with them if it informs part of the process. If you're accusing them of completing timesheets incorrectly, you must be able to show and share the timesheets and point out why you think their clock in, clock out times weren't correct. If there's an issue to do with behaviour, you must have examples that you can speak to go, here is what I mean by your passive aggression at work, and here are the examples of times when you behaved in a way that was passive aggressive. That's not okay in our business. They also can ask for more information if it's relevant. So if you've done a good job of giving them everything that you're considering, chances are low that they're going to ask for more information because they already have it. They've got information in front of them. But if they ask questions or they ask for more information that's relevant to what's been going on, you do need to provide that to them in a timely manner so that they can see everything and understand everything that's informing the situation. They're also, of course, allowed a reasonable time to seek advice and prepare a response as part of the process. In terms of what a reasonable time looks like, we start out at 2 working days. So if you were to give them the letter on Monday, that's a meeting on Wednesday afternoon or on Thursday to have allowed them time to seek advice. But anything up to about 2 weeks is typically reasonable, especially if they have obligations or commitments which would make it hard for them to seek advice. So if you have someone who is a parent of 3 small children and works part-time and has school pickups and drop-offs, understandably, they might need a bit more time to find time in their life to speak to a lawyer or a representative than someone who maybe doesn't have those sorts of commitments. And so if an employee asks for more time to prepare a response, we say up to 2 weeks is reasonable. Beyond that, I would decline to agree to that most of the time. I think it's too long, but they are entitled to time to seek advice and prepare that response. Tied into that is their right to representation and or support. So if they want to bring a lawyer or an advocate along, they can do that. If they want to bring a friend or their partner or a family member or their whānau to a response meeting just for emotional support, they have a legal right to have those people present, and we would strongly recommend accommodating them. Lastly, employees have, well, this isn't a conclusive list, but it's pretty thorough. Employees have a right of reply to the decision makers in the process. What I mean by that is if the person ultimately making the decision about whether they do or don't get issued a formal warning is the operations manager, and they're only having meetings with their supervisor, and then the supervisor is relaying information back to the ops manager, that's not going to be acceptable because the employee has the right to share their feedback and be heard out by the person who's making a decision. So ultimately what they're saying to the supervisor probably is going to get back to the ops manager, but they do have a right at some point to be engaged in the process with the operations manager who's making the decision so that they can be pleading their case basically to the person who's making the call. So let's go through the process and talk about what happens when we are running a disciplinary here. So in terms of prep, we want to make sure that we've documented the situation, we've gathered supporting information, and we're outlining potential consequences. So this might be gathering statements from witnesses, it might be going back through your emails and pulling up examples of times when you had to chase them for something or when they missed a deadline. Whatever information supports your argument or your claim that they have not done X, Y, Z, or they are behaving in a way that's inappropriate, gather that together and make sure you've got it in a pack that you can be sharing with them. An important part to decide on is what the potential outcome of the process might be. So are we talking about a formal written warning? Are we talking about a final written warning? Are we talking about dismissal? Make it really clear to them what the potential outcome is, because the way that we react to a disciplinary process, which might result in a warning, can be very different to how we would respond to a disciplinary process that might result in losing our jobs. So make it clear what the outcome is that you're considering, considering. You cannot escalate above that if you change your mind partway through, but you can drop it down if, as part of the process, you understand that the circumstances might have been different to what you expected, and therefore the issue isn't as severe. You can drop it down, but you can't escalate partway through. Well, you can, but there's kind of a reconsult piece that has to happen then. Notify your employee of the process, right, or of the issue. So tell them what the issue is, share the supporting information, whether that's all printed out, whether it's an email with CCTV footage attached, and include how they knew the issue wasn't acceptable. We can't punish, we can't discipline people if they weren't aware that what they're doing wasn't appropriate, which is where employment agreements, company policies, training, any other conversations we've had with them, any other kind of expectations that we've set are useful. Be really clear be really clear in your story that the employee knew that XYZ wasn't okay because of the agreement they signed or the policy they signed or previous chats you've had with them. Again, name your potential outcome, whether it's a formal warning, a final, or dismissal. Include timelines. So say we'd like to meet with you again to hear your response 3 days from now, a week from now, in person or on video call, whatever the method is you're using. And be really clear that they have a legal right to seek advice, whether, again, that's from a union or a lawyer or an advocate. Invitation to a response meeting is quite important, because if you don't book that next meeting, they're not clear on what their timeframes are and you don't have something in your calendar. So where you can include the date of the response meeting in that piece there. And then your meeting adjourns. So stage 1 is just about doing your prep, gathering all your information and handing that to your employee and saying, we have a problem. We are starting a disciplinary process to address your poor performance or your conduct at work. Here is the information that we have. Here's the next steps in terms of timeframes. We're considering a formal written warning as an outcome. You have a right to seek advice and to prepare a response, and we would like to hear your response 3 days from now. And then it ends. This is a communication meeting only. There are no decisions made. There's no feedback heard. You are just saying, here is the issue. We've started the process, and now you get to go away and consider what's in front of you. Often at these meetings, employees will, especially if they feel like they've been falsely accused or that the issue isn't actually as big a problem as you might think it is, they'll start to respond and say, oh, but what you don't know is XYZ, and oh, what I need to tell you is that, so-and-so's a dickhead and has never liked me, and what you're not aware is I was working really hard that day and I had lots going on. If they start to respond, cut them off and say, totally appreciate you've got some thoughts about this. You have a legal right to consider this and go away and come back with a response. I really don't want you to say anything today that you might not say once you've cooled down and read through all of this information. So I'm going to stop you there. I don't want to hear your response today. You need to go away and have a think about it and then come back to me. And you might get but I just want to say one thing. Just go, look, I'm going to stop you. It's really important to us that we follow a fair legal process here. And a fair legal process involves you going away, having time to consider it, and coming back when you've processed it all and know what you want to say. So I'm going to stop you. We're going to end the meeting. Do you have any questions? Otherwise, let's wrap it. Be really, really firm about not getting them to respond in that meeting. Anything they say at that meeting, you can't really consider as part of their response because they haven't had that reasonable time. And also, if they do say something that you can't unhear, there's going to be a disadvantage to them because they didn't have that time to think calmly and rationally about what they might want to say. So employee has their consideration time. They've gone away, had a read through everything and sought advice if they wanted to. And now we're at the employee's response meeting. So we're at stage 2. So this is their time to provide their response or their commentary in response to the allegations that you've presented them with. So this might be as short as, I totally agree. I've got nothing to add. I'm really sorry. It was totally my bad. I missed those deadlines. That's kind of my cock up and I'll own it. Sorry. Or you might get a 15-page argument with a very detailed counter response and heaps of examples about why you're the baddie and they're not the bad guy and all this kind of stuff. So once they've given you their feedback, typically you'll then have some questions. So ask questions, clarify if you need to. If you're not sure on something, like ask and check to see if your understanding is correct. And then the meeting adjourns. Again, no decisions are being made today. This is just them presenting you with their feedback and saying, here's my side of the story. Here's information you might not have had. Here's context you might not be aware of. Here's something that I need to add to the picture that you have. So no decisions. Again, it's just information coming back to you from the employee with their feedback. Now, because this is a consultation process, you must listen to and consider their feedback. However, this doesn't mean that you have to agree. Understanding and agreeing are two very different things. So all that's required is that you listen to and consider their feedback. And if they say anything which changes your mind about the severity of the process or what it is that you want to be running the disciplinary for, that's great. We can deal with that at the next stage. But you don't have to agree with them, okay? What's really important is at that meeting, if they say something and you think that's just an absolute load of bollocks, you are not being truthful, that's not how it went, I totally disagree, don't say that in the meeting, because you are indicating that you aren't actually considering their feedback, even if you know it not to be true or not to be accurate. And anything you do as an outcome is potentially predetermined, because in that meeting you went, you're a liar, I don't believe you, I'm not going to listen to what you have to say. So keep your temper. Make sure you're taking notes. If you disagree with something, note it down. But in the meeting, you just need to receive their feedback. Don't make any comments that might predetermine your outcome, and don't tell them they're a liar or that you disagree with them. There'll be time to manage that in the next stage. So we've heard their feedback, we've heard what they have to say, and now we're at the confirming outcome stage of things. So stage 3 is about sort of wrapping up the process. What's important here is documenting your response to their feedback. So if they had a bunch of counterpoints that they wanted to make about why it was okay for them to be an hour late that day, or why they were justified in shouting at a customer because the customer was being a real dickhead, whatever the response is, if you agree or disagree with their points, do note it down and explain why you agree or disagree. For two reasons. One, it shows that you listened to what they had to say, and that you have a response to it, which is part of meeting that obligation around listening to their feedback. If you don't document what your response to it is, it's hard to say that you did actually listen, because how do we know you didn't say anything in response? So document that down. The second reason is that if they then challenge the disciplinary, or raise a personal grievance later, you have a document that says, yeah, you said that you had called and made contact on the day that you were late, but we have looked at our supervisor's phone records and there are no incoming calls from you. So we don't think that that is accurate. And we told you at the time that we don't think it's accurate, so you can just go away with your personal grievance very nicely, thank you. So one, it's about meeting a legal obligation, and two, it's kind of practical documentation of what happened so that you've got a bit of protection or pre-work in case there is a grievance come down the line. Confirm the outcome. Have they been issued with a formal? Have they been issued with a final? What is the outcome of the process, and let them know. If it's a warning, you are required to provide them support and coaching to help improve the issue. We strongly recommend doing this through a performance improvement plan. So they'll get a letter confirming the warning, they're getting a draft performance improvement plan. We'll work on that to kind of agree what the criteria are, and then that's in place for the next 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, or what have you. If you just issue someone with a warning, particularly for poor performance, and then do nothing to help them and step back and go, well, it's a you problem now. I've told you it's an issue and you have to improve it. Ultimately, if you do try and dismiss them, it's likely that a challenge to that dismissal would succeed, because you haven't acted reasonably in giving them support, coaching, training, guidance to improve the issue. Now, if it's a dismissal, a slight change to the process here. At this final meeting, there is an extra step where we have to say we've confirmed issues of poor performance, or we consider our allegations of serious misconduct have been upheld. We are therefore proposing to end your employment in accordance with the first documentation we issued you. And you now get an extra 10 to 15 minutes to think about this proposal, and we'll come back into the meeting room. It feels really unnecessary in the moment, because you told them, a week ago that you were thinking about termination as an option. It's just a weird quirk of the case law that at this final meeting, you need to again say, cool, we're proposing dismissal today because we've confirmed these issues have happened. We're going to leave the room to give you 10 to 15 minutes to consider and come back and hear your feedback. We'll come back into the room and hear your feedback. We'll leave the room again for 10 to 15 minutes to consider, and then we'll come back in and confirm termination. In 10 years of working, well, 11 now, in a decade of working in HR, I've never seen a termination meeting that hasn't gone ahead after this step. It is a bit of a formality, but it's a legal formality that forms a part of that procedural fairness piece that will trip you up if an employee challenges it. So for the sake of an extra 20 minutes in your process, just jump in, because the chances of changing your mind are very minimal. And then the meeting adjourns. So if you've terminated them, this is with summary dismissal, then you can walk them out of the building, kind of help them collect their stuff and move them on in their employment that day. If you've agreed it's a formal written warning, they get the documentation, they get the PIP, and we start working through things. But you've concluded your disciplinary process with the outcomes of a warning and a PIP or termination, depending on the circumstances. So to talk about some examples where disciplinaries were appropriate and the level of outcome that we got to, the first one I want to talk about is where there is something like a complaint. So if Sanjeev raises a complaint about his colleague Ashley, Sanjeev's employer has a policy in place which requires a formal capital I investigation into the issue. If at the end of the investigation they've determined that yes, Ashley was being consistently rude and not meeting the company's code of conduct, we'll start a disciplinary process to take her to a formal written warning there. It's very unusual for small and medium-sized businesses to have policies which require investigations if a complaint is raised. It tends to be something for the public sector, for larger corporate businesses with thousands of employees, so we don't see it in our world very often. But if there's a complaint or we get some feedback that someone was being a dick at work and we find out that they have been, typically a formal written warning is the level to which we'll go. Now, Aroha works in sales and is consistently missing her sales target, so she has a monthly quota that she needs to meet. We'll start a disciplinary process at the level of a formal written warning, and because we're talking about performance, we'll put a PIP in place to support her with that behaviour going forward. To support her with that performance going forward. Sometimes there are ongoing issues. So John is on a final warning for repeat lateness. This week he's lost his temper at a customer and the customer has complained. So regardless of what the formal written warning and the final written warning were for, this new issue means that we can be considering dismissal on notice for John. It's not a serious misconduct issue. It's not so bad that he might forfeit his right to his notice period, but it's not okay to lose your temper at a customer. And because we are already on a final written warning, the one-up escalation of that is dismissal on notice for John. Now, let's talk about negligence and where we might go to serious misconduct. So we managed a situation probably 6 years ago where we had a manufacturing client whose finance manager in the scenario Hunsol, obviously I've renamed everyone I'm talking about here, ignored messages from the electrical supplier that their prices and plans were changing. They had, I think, about 12 weeks of correspondence from their electrical supplier saying, hey, prices are going up if you don't tell us which, or plans are changing. If you don't tell us what plan you want to be on, you'll default to this one, which would increase your electricity bills by about $380,000 a year. Please tell us what plan you want to be on. And the finance manager just ignored those emails, although they were responding to other correspondence in and around those messages. So on the date that the plans changed, the company was defaulted onto the plan with the electrical supplier. That immediately jumped their monthly electrical bill by about $35,000. So the manager didn't assault or abuse or harass anyone, but as the finance manager, they are totally responsible for being across the details of their supplier relationships for the smaller business. And the issue was serious enough that it completely undermined the business's trust and confidence in this person to do their job and to do what's required. So we went through a process and ended up summarily dismissing this person with no notice period because their failure to deal with the issue was so severe and had such a serious consequence for the business. And they were in a senior position where that level of care is totally a part of the role. So common mistakes, and then we will jump to talking about bonus material and questions. So here are some things you want to avoid if you're running a disciplinary process. Don't move too slowly. So if you have someone who kind of is always a bit of a niggle in terms of they're always late to work or they're just never that organized or tidy with their work, if you ignore it, and then one day totally lose your temper because you've had it up to fucking here with them and you just want to get rid of them, we actually can't do anything about that trail of behavior, about that pattern of behavior, because you have done nothing about it, and therefore it has been acceptable to you for 2 months, 6 months, a year. Sometimes we get people calling us up about. So don't move too slowly, because it's not fair to someone to not be telling them this behavior is an issue and suddenly want to fire them because you've lost your rag. That's not reasonable behavior. Likewise, don't move too fast. So if there is an issue that you're aware of, take your time to do your fact finding, figure out what's going on and decide how to move forward. A classic example that we had was, this is a few years ago now, a client who works in retail had a complaint raised by a young gentleman who basically accused his woman colleague of bullying and being awful and just being terrible and calling him terrible names and being really rude to him. Like it was a really nasty complaint. So the store manager freaked out and jumped into a disciplinary to address the issue. So they have a meeting with this young woman who's, wants to respond, and they have to wait till the response meeting. And at the response meeting, it turns out that they had been in a relationship and she had broken up with the young man. And so his complaint was an attempt to get back at her because he didn't want to break up. And the young woman had done none of those things, and the evidence kind of supported that. So the manager, very red-faced, had to walk it back and chose to apologize to the young woman for reacting more severely or more harshly than he would have done had he kind of had all the information to hand. So don't move too fast, because you might do something that's not appropriate or out of proportion to the situation you're managing. If you have information that's informing your disciplinary, please make sure you share it. If you don't share it at the top of the process and the employee asks for it and you need to share it later on, that kind of restarts the clock on their time to consider what's in front of them and get advice. So if you start a meeting on day 1 or start a disciplinary on day 1, then they ask for information on day 7 because they've spoken to a lawyer, you don't provide it till day 14, they now have between 2 and 10 business days from day 14 to provide you with a response, because they've just received new information. So they have a right to consider that information. It restarts the clock on that time period. This is a really broad kind of indicator, but don't behave unfairly or unreasonably as an employer. Again, whether that's having unachievable high standards for what you're expecting your team to achieve, whether that's holding information back, whether it's not providing people with support and training. It's a really broad instruction, I know, but where you can behave fairly and reasonably, that will set you up really, really well to then manage any issues that do come to the fore, as well as not creating legal liability for the business because you're making choices that aren't defensible. Treating employees very differently also will cause you problems. So if you're holding Alex to account for her lateness and pinging her and keep giving her feedback, and then you've got someone else in the same team who maybe you like a bit more, who's a better employee, and you're not treating them exactly the same when it comes to lateness, that can cause problems because you're not being fair and reasonable in addressing all issues equally. Now, that's not to say that you must treat everyone exactly the same, but where there are very, very large discrepancies in how you treat your staff, that may cause you problems in terms of you not acting fairly and reasonably. It's a bit of a grey area, because what's appropriate for a senior member of the business who's been there for 6 years, has put the time in and has a lot of trust with the employer, you might choose to let a few things slip because, again, overall, you know that they're a good person to have in the business. They've just had a couple of off days, versus someone new or newer to the business who you're working much more intensely with because they are new. There's obviously going to be different standards of what's expected in terms of behaviour and how they show up to work. That's probably going to be okay. What I'm talking about is being really, really harsh or really awful to someone in the business who's in a similar role to someone else, and then being really inconsistent with how you treat those employees. That'll cause some problems too. Not following up on a PIP or post-disciplinary commitments will get you into trouble. Make sure you do what you say you will do, so that you're showing, again, that you're being constructive and responsive in that employment relationship. Being too severe with your outcome. If someone is late to work twice, you can't fire them for that. That's not a reasonable choice to make. So be clear around what is reasonable in terms of potential consequence for the issue. And not giving employees long enough to get advice or prepare a response is something we see pretty consistently, where you have a manager who's hot under the collar, wants to have the meeting on Monday, make a decision Tuesday. That is not procedurally fair. Your disciplinary will fall over if you make those choices. You can still make them, like, we can choose to speed 60 in a 50k zone or go 105 k's on a 100k section on the motorway. You can make those choices, but if you get a ticket, you're going to get a ticket. If you choose to not give someone enough time and the employee challenges it, you will be on the hook for thousands of dollars in terms of settlement fees. So take the time to avoid those legal liabilities later. Last piece for me, then I'll jump into questions. We do have some bonus resources for you in your follow-up email. So as I mentioned earlier, you'll get the webinar recording and slides from today. We'll also be sharing a disciplinary process map, so you can get a sense of the different pieces of the puzzle and have that as a resource if you need it. And as well, you are welcome to book, if you're not a client, a 20-minute complimentary consultation session with me. If there's anything you're managing in your business that you want to have a conversation about, if there's something going on that you just want to have to check in and get some expert guidance on, you're welcome to book that with me. It's not a hard sell, hopefully you can tell from the tone of this environment. We can just have a conversation and see what's going on. Or if you are a client, again, you're welcome to book through there, or if you want to give our team a call in New Zealand on 0800 69 4769, the advisory team will be able to help you out there. So Thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to speak with you all today. We had at most, I think, about 182 people on the call, which is fantastic. So thank you for coming along. I trust you found had something valuable from that session. What I will do is jump out of the Prezzo here and then just go into time for questions and make myself big again so you can see my head as I'm talking to you. And I'll jump into the Q&A now and start working through. But if you don't want to stick around for the Q&A, you're welcome to leave. And really thank you for coming along today and for spending some time with us. So let's get into the Q&A and jump through. Anonymous asks, kia ora Anonymous, thank you for coming along. If an issue has been brought to you by someone else, and if that person doesn't want to be known, are you allowed to not share where the info came from to the employee you're raising the issue with if they ask for more information? This is the problem that we run into most commonly when it comes to kicking off a disciplinary process with small businesses. So the short answer is no. If I was to come to you and say, hey, I'm raising a complaint about my colleague John, I think John's being really awful and I think he's bullying me and here are my examples and here's the behaviour, but I don't want you to name me in the process, your hands are basically tied as an employer. You must honour the request of the employee to have their concern be treated confidentially. You cannot run a disciplinary with John and say, John, we're accusing you of bullying, but I can't tell you what the details are or who's raised that complaint, because that's not fair to John. He has a right of reply and he has a right to know what the material is that he's being taken through a disciplinary for. You have a couple of options. If the complaint is to do with something related to potential injury, harm, or death to the person who's complaining or the person about whom the complaint has been raised, that's kind of the moment you want to get the police or support services involved, because the risk of there being harm kind of outweighs the privacy obligation, but that's usually not what's happening. Usually it's about someone being afraid of retribution. So what you can do is work with them and go, I'm so glad you told me, thank you so much. If that behaviour is occurring, I'm really concerned and I don't want it to be happening in our business. Let's talk about a plan to move forward and to try and resolve this. And what you want to try and do is earn their trust to the point that they will allow you to document their concerns and go on the record to go to John with the disciplinary process. And you can say to them, look, I really want to address this issue, but I can't unless we go on the record. It's not fair for me to say to John, there's been some bullying happening and we're firing you. I have to give John the information that I have so that John can provide a response. Would you feel comfortable doing that if we let you work from home for the next couple of weeks? If we moved John into a different team while this was all going on? If we provided you with some kind of other support or wraparound to make sure that you didn't feel worried about retribution from him? So there are some things that you can do to try and get them to a point where they are confident going on the record, but ultimately if they don't, your hands are tied in terms of dealing with it formally. The third thing you can do is you can choose to act in ways that help protect that person from the alleged behaviour, which aren't punitive to the other employee, but does address the issue. So again, working from home for that employee might help separate them. Maybe there's some work you can do with John around his communication style and kind of frame that in, hey, I've observed that often you are blunt or direct or a bit crass with the way that you talk to your colleagues. I would like for us to do some work around this because I don't want it to become a problem. Or maybe you can do some work with John around sort of some of the other behaviours that are causing issues. So you can address it and expand the justification for addressing it are other reasons, not that there's been a complaint raised, but if the person doesn't want to go on the record, you're sort of limited in terms of the formal steps you can take. So again, if your employee doesn't want to go on the record, first, if it's to do with potential harm or injury or death to themselves or to others, you can escalate that to the police. If you can work with the employee to get them to a point where they are comfortable going on the record, that can then trigger that disciplinary piece with John. Or if there are other things you can do kind of in the mix of business as usual to help manage the issue in a way that doesn't kind of negatively affect John or punish John, but that would resolve the issue, you might want to consider those options as well. But it is really hard to manage, and you can't unknow this. You can't unknow that someone is so uncomfortable working with John that they've raised a bullying complaint. What becomes really hard is making sure that you show up in an objective, unbiased way for John, because at the moment you've only got one person's side of the story. You don't have two people's side of the story. So you can't start thinking of John as a bad person, even though you know that there's been a complaint about him. Cool. Jen, kia ora Jen, thank you for coming along, asks, when bringing support to a disciplinary meeting, how much input can that support person have? So when an employee brings a support person to a meeting, that support person is not expected or really has the mandate to have any input into the meeting. So if I was running a disciplinary process and I had a support person who might say things to the employee like, maybe they're going through their response to the allegations, the support person might say, oh, remember to tell them about that thing, or so-and-so, remember, did you explain to them what happened here on that day where they're saying that you weren't late? So if they're helping and supporting the employee to present an informed, complete response, I'm really comfortable with that. That's the role of a support person, is to be supportive in the moment. If the support person is jumping in on behalf of the employee, I nip that in the bud really quickly. They're not the employee's representative. It's really important that we hear from the employee, because that's who our relationship is with. That's who the potential consequences are going to fall on. So if I have a support person saying, yeah, and you guys, and this, and I don't think it's fair, and data, and kind of giving me their perspective, often I'll say, cool, like I've heard what you have to say. Just to reset expectations, my understanding is that you're here as Sylvie's support person. Is that correct? Are you here as a support person for them? Okay, so what I really want to do is hear from Sylvie in this instance, because I do need to know what it is that she has to say. If there's anything that you would like to raise, you're welcome to take a break and go and raise that with the person you're supporting, and they can bring it to me. But I do want to hear directly from them on this, and kind of just reset and remanage those boundaries. I've been in disciplinary meetings where, as the HR person, where the support person has been so disruptive and so aggressive that I've actually said, look, I would like to, and I've tried to kind of keep them back in line, to say, look, I would like to adjourn the meeting here. I'm concerned that we are not hearing from Sylvie with her feedback, because Edward, you keep jumping in with your comments. So we're going to adjourn the meeting. I would like to have another conversation with Sylvie later. You are welcome to attend, but my expectations are that I'm hearing from Sylvie and I'm not getting this feedback from you. And even just the threat of mentioning that will often get them to simmer down. But the role of a support person is to be supportive from an emotional perspective, to help the employee present an informed response. And then if they start getting kind of a bit too involved beyond that, I will call them out and try to get them to settle down. Good. We are now at 1:59 p.m. and I said we would go to 2. We've had a big drop off in the last little while, which is fantastic. If you do need to go and get into the rest of your day, I'll totally understand. I won't be judging you or heckling you as you choose to leave the webinar. I am going to stick around for the next 15 minutes and answer more questions. So if that's useful to you, you're welcome to stick around as well. But if you do choose to wrap, that's totally fine, because we are at it for time today. So Matthew, kia ora Matthew, says, with notes on My HR, is there a time when historical notes can no longer be used for a disciplinary process? Yeah, there is. And this question came in before I mentioned kind of those time limits towards the end, so I'll speak to them again. So we tend to say 2 to 4 weeks generally. Anything beyond that is kind of stale. You've sort of missed your chance to address that as part of a disciplinary process. That's a really broad rule of thumb. There are some circumstances where a pattern of behaviour is going to take longer than 2 to 4 weeks to establish, particularly if it's interpersonal. It has to do with bullying or passive aggression or any of that kind of stuff. So there is a point at which we kind of have to go, that's sort of historical. We can't really include it any longer. Typically, we say 2 to 4 weeks. If we haven't addressed an issue within that period of time, you've kind of missed the boat a bit. But that's a really rough rule of thumb. There are some circumstances where it's totally relevant to include stuff that's happened before, because that's as long as it takes for a pattern to emerge. So sort of a how long is a piece of string question, generally 2 to 4 weeks, but depending on circumstances, that can be longer. Anonymous asks, can you have 1 hour between step 2 and step 3? So between hearing the employee's response and meeting with them again in the 3rd meeting to confirm an outcome, can you have an hour? If that hour genuinely allows you to consider what they've had to say, make a decision, and then meet with them to confirm an outcome, yes, you can do. That tends to be what happens when the meeting is just, yeah, I did it, I was late on those 5 occasions, or yeah, I know I messed up with that presentation and didn't get it to you in time repeatedly. That's my bad. Like I'll just take it on the chin. I accept I've done something wrong here. So they haven't actually given you anything to consider. They've just said, yes, I agree with what you're saying. So you can then take that hour to go away, write out your notes, kind of confirm the outcome, draft a PIP and bring it back to them. If that's reasonable, yes, you can do that. In most circumstances, there will be more to consider, which you wouldn't reasonably be able to do in an hour. I tend to manage expectations to say expected to be about a day in between the second meeting where you're hearing their feedback and the third meeting where you're confirming the outcome. But if an hour is enough for you to genuinely consider their response and get your paperwork sorted for the next step, yeah, that's fine. Cool. Anonymous says, really good summary, thank you. Oh, thank you, appreciate that feedback. They ask, can the employee be suspended while the disciplinary process is going on? The short answer is sometimes. So if there is a clause in their employment agreement which says we may suspend you if we are investigating allegations of serious misconduct, you may be able to suspend them if the issue is serious misconduct. So if it's poor performance or misconduct or any of that kind of stuff, it is very, very unlikely you would be able to suspend them, because suspension is a very intense or a very severe or a very full-on kind of outcome for an employee. We tend to only do it when we're trying to prevent potential harm to others, like if there's been an allegation of bullying. Most of the time I will suspend as part of that process. Prevent them from tampering with anything in place. So if there's like a fraud claim, or if they have access to records that they might be able to go in and quickly change to show that they didn't do the bad thing I'm saying that they did, in those cases I would suspend. Or where there's a chance that they might interfere with kind of people and like do a bit of a campaign of intimidation and go around being like, if you talk to HR, I'm going to punch your lights out, or any of that kind of stuff. In those circumstances, suspension tends to be reasonable. When you're suspending, of course, there's a process. It's a proposal to say, hey, we've had allegations of X, Y, Z, or I've seen CCTV footage that implies that shows that you might be stealing. To give us time to investigate this, I'm proposing we suspend you from work. You would be on full pay during that time. What do you have to say? Oh, I come back 15 minutes later. Cool, I've heard what you have to say. I'm confirming we're suspending you in accordance with your employment agreement. You'll be on full pay during this time. Your access to all of your systems will be cut off for now, and we'll be in touch about next steps. So you can suspend as part of the process in limited circumstances, and typically you need a clause in their employment agreement to do it. If someone complains, it's from Anonymous, if someone complains about their manager in confidence, can you investigate, or do you need their permission to raise the issues with the manager? Oh, I just had my video is cut out. I think that's still working now. Tell me if that's gone, but I think you should be able to see me. So again, if someone complains or raises a frustration or a complaint with you, you need them to be on the record and comfortable that you can then go to the manager and say, hey, I've had some complaints come through. I'd like to investigate this. Here's next steps. Here's what we're going to do about it. Sometimes if you have had 5 employees all anonymously complain about their manager, you can run a disciplinary process and say, everyone in your team has complained. Here are the details of the complaints, and we're either investigating or we're running a disciplinary process to figure out what's happened. And what you then can do is kind of aggregate the complaints. So you're not saying Sylvie emailed with this and Tom emailed with this and Ashley emailed. You're saying, here is the material of it. You need to be aware it's come from all 5 of your staff, and kind of here's what we're going to do about it. You still need the permission of those 5 staff to go on the record, but you can explain to them and say, I'm not going to put your names to the complaints, but I am going to share the substance, because we have received enough complaints here that there's clearly an issue, but we're not naming each and every one of you. We're going to anonymize it to the level that we can. So sometimes you can run it that way, but most of the time, if an employee complains, you need their permission to go on the record and do anything about it, whether that's investigate, run a disciplinary, do what the next steps are. Justine asks, in the case of aroha, would a PIP not be required before a formal written warning? Not always. So it's totally fine to go to a disciplinary process with a potential formal written warning if there are performance issues. Depending on the vibe of the business and how the manager likes to deal with things, starting with a PIP is a softer option before then going to a formal written warning. If you start with a PIP, most of the time it's because you genuinely think this person can improve, and you're very committed to giving them support and trying to help them get there. And if they can't, that's when you'll kick off a disciplinary. But there's no legal requirement to do that. If a person is underperforming or is consistently inconsistent with their performance, you can start at a disciplinary rather than starting at a PIP and then going to a disciplinary. It depends on the circumstances, kind of what feels appropriate, what's reasonable for your business, but there's no legal requirement to start with a PIP. Lucy asks, Kia ora, Lucy, is the slideshow available to participants? Yes, it will be. You'll get an email in the next couple of days with access to the recording and the slides, so you can access them there once we're done. Anonymous asks, we have an issue with a team member who always has a personal issue when we informally discuss issues with them. I feel like he will use this against us if we take the process further. What are your thoughts? The latest is that his dad is ill and has been for 6 months, hence his behaviour or performance. I'm going to sound really harsh when I say it kind of doesn't matter ultimately. If someone is an amazing performer, then maybe they go through a change in their life, or they have a bereavement and they're off for a few weeks or a month, like off the game, not off work. Then you might just go, look, I'm going to give them some grace and sort of let them have a few weeks of not being as good as they normally are, because I know when they come out of their grief, or they come out of their transition from the stress of moving house, they're going to be back on form, and that'll be fine. You might choose to give someone that grace, but if it sounds like with this person, they are refusing to be held accountable for a pattern of behavior and performance at work. And if someone always shows up with a reason or an explanation, there's a sense that they will never be able to be held accountable, because there will always be something. All of us always have things going on in our personal lives that are stressful or are taking our attention away from things. So in my view, and I would probably be advising you to start a formal process with this person, depending on the circumstance, whether that's a PIP or a formal written warning. And their feedback to you can be, this is total bullshit, you guys are awful, like I've told you about all my problems, rah, rah, rah. And you can say, yep, we've heard that, we are sympathetic to your circumstances. However, this has been an ongoing pattern of lateness, or an ongoing pattern of underperformance, and we are now holding you account, and we are asking for things to change, and we're here to figure out what that might look like for you, but this is no longer acceptable. We're kind of drawing a line in the sand. So it is uncomfortable, because you feel like you're being made out to be the bad guy, because they've got, they're separated from their partner, or co-parenting's not going so well, or they're recovering from a difficult something. Whatever it is, you feel like the bad guy, but you're not. You are holding them to account for the way that they behave and the way that they perform at work, and they can throw as much mud at you as they want. If what you're asking of them is reasonable, you kind of just have to hold the line a bit and be prepared to deal with the discomfort. That's sometimes where getting an HR person involved, or a consultant involved, or getting us can be quite useful, because we're the disinterested third party who can be the objective kind of pair of eyes and help you manage the process and manage the pushback. Merwin is asking for the difference between a support person and a representative. Good question. So a representative is someone who is speaking on behalf of the employee. They're there to be the buffer between yourself as the employer and the employee. So they are speaking on behalf of the employee and putting their best foot forward. They tend to be a lawyer or an advocate or a consultant with some experience in this space, and they tend to be the person you communicate with about the issue. So you'll receive emails from them, you'll email back to them. They are the person handling this on behalf of the employee, if that makes sense. A support person is literally just there to provide support. They are not speaking on behalf of the employee. They're usually a personal relation, so a friend, family member, sometimes a couple of the whānau will come along, and they're not there to speak to you. They're there to buffer the employee and make them feel supported so that they can put their best foot forward. So a support person, the employee is still speaking for themselves. With a representative, the rep will speak on behalf of the employee. And one more question from Justine. Of course, you ask as many questions as you want, Justine. If someone has 3 warnings for 3 different things, for example, lateness, reputational damage, and poor performance, is that enough to be fired? They all have to be for the same thing. No, they don't all need to be for the same thing. If someone is on a formal written warning, they are on a formal written warning. If they do something that takes them to a final, they are on a final. If they do something that takes them to the next step of whatever the issue would be, that's dismissal with notice in our world. So you don't have to have 2 warnings for lateness and 1 warning for reputational damage and then 1 warning for being a dickhead and then 2. That would be super unreasonable, right? If they're on a formal, they're on a formal. If they're on a final, they're on a final. The next time they do something you would discipline them for, you can take that to dismissal on notice. Anonymous asks, if an employee resigns, can he or she still be dismissed via the disciplinary process earlier than his or her notice period? You can still run a disciplinary process with someone during their notice period. That's totally fine. But the only circumstances where you would get them out of the business faster is if the disciplinary was for a serious misconduct issue where that has the potential outcome of being fired with no notice period. So if it's a series of warnings and then you dismiss them, in those circumstances, it's dismissal with notice. They still have access to their 2-week or 4-week notice period. So you're not really at an advantage there because you need to pay them out or have them in the business for their notice period anyway. But if it's a serious misconduct issue, you can start the disciplinary process for that. And then if you get to the outcome, which is summary dismissal, you might shave a week or two off their notice period. Most of the time, it's not an advantage to run another process just because of the time it takes and the energy required. So yeah, unless you have a very clear serious misconduct issue, I don't think you'd be an advantage there to run a process. Anonymous asks, when someone gets a written warning or formal warning, does it just stay on their records and there's no expiry for it, meaning that they've cleansed it out of their file? That's a great question. Warnings do have a shelf life to them. You can choose as a business what that shelf life is as long as it's reasonable. So our default start date is to say 12 months. So once the warning's been on their file for 12 months, if nothing else has happened, it's like the warning has reverted back to no warning, if that makes sense. So if you're on a formal written warning for repeat lateness and after 12 months there's been no further instances, the warning has happened, there is a record of it, but you're back to being on no warnings because it's been 12 months and nothing else has happened. That can be 6 months. Sometimes you could say 24 months or 2 years if you wanted to, but anything longer than a year, you're going to need a good reason for it to last that long, because the case law says that after a certain point in time, kind of the activeness of a warning fades away, like it's not as relevant because time has passed, kind of, you know, they've been in the business with no other issues. That issue kind of has to be archived, not ignored or like it never happened. It doesn't get erased, but it gets archived. It's not of importance anymore. Roel says, very great and so informative. Thanks, Sylvie. You're welcome, Roel, anytime. Shannon, kia ora, Shannon, nice to see you. How are you doing? Says, very informative, thank you. Just wanted to clarify your points on dismissal for ongoing issues. You mentioned you could dismiss on a separate issue, such as yelling at a customer unrelated to formal warning or final written warning in place. Yeah, there's some guidance on MB, which I think you've got here, which says a warning for one type of misconduct can't be relied on when dealing with another type of warning for misconduct. There's case law which supports it both ways on that one. We've kind of got legal advice that says it's fine for us to manage them that way. So we're reasonably confident we're not going to be creating any legal problems doing things that way. I think there is an argument to say it's not reasonable to rely on totally unrelated warnings, but I've never seen that successfully executed. There might be a case I'm not aware of, but in the environment that we're operating with, the legal advice that we've got, yeah, we're fine for it to be unrelated warnings for you to terminate and move on with. Good question, Shannon. Then Anonymous says, we had a meeting with an employee who others had complained about. We gave her an opportunity to respond, but didn't set out potential consequences. How can we go back and start the process again? The short answer is you might not be able to if you have already gotten her to speak to the issue without making it clear that what she says might result in there being a warning applied to her. What I mean by that is, if you raise an issue with an employee and say, hey, we want to talk to you about this issue, and then the employee says, okay, well, here's my side of the story, chat. And then you go, cool, now that we have that information, we're going to run a disciplinary, you might get a warning. That employee has been disadvantaged because they weren't aware of what the potential consequences were when you spoke to them, right? So there's more information which might change that advice there. So Anonymous, I'd recommend giving us a call if you're a client, or giving a consultant a call, or booking time with me to talk about it in more detail. The short answer is you may not be able to reset and now be in a warning process because you've already gotten information from that person, not in the pipeline of a disciplinary process. And so now potentially there being consequences for her when she wasn't aware of them might not be reasonable. Last question, we're at 2:16 p.m. I've got a bunch of questions here I haven't been able to get to, so if I've missed them out, I will do my very best in the next few days to come back to you and respond. So where were they? Christian, kia ora Christian, asks, can we question a team member during the disciplinary process on specifics regarding misconduct or serious misconduct? For example, why did this occur? Do they understand how this breaches their contract and duties, as examples? You can absolutely ask questions of an employee, but you, as much as possible, you don't want them to be leading questions as a matter of best practice. So if in their response meeting they say ABC happened, you can say, tell me more about A, like why did you think that it was okay to come to work this early? Had you had any communication from your manager? Like why did that happen that way? That's fine, because you're asking to clarify, to understand what their response is. If they then get to C, you can say, hold on, so you're telling me that with C, you thought that you weren't allowed to do this thing, but when you talked about step A, you said that you had been deliberately instructed to do this thing. So what's correct? Is it correct that you hadn't been told to move the stock from this room to this room, or had you been told to move the stock? I'm not clear here. So you can, when I say interrogate, I don't mean like pin them on it, but you can probe their response to understand what it is they're trying to tell you for more information. Questions like, do you understand why that's not acceptable? Indicates that you've predetermined whether it is or isn't acceptable, and that might cause you problems when you come to make a decision about the outcome. It totally depends on the facts and the order of events here, but broadly I would say totally fine to ask questions to clarify and understand what's happened. But if you're trying to get them to admit that they did the wrong thing, or if you're trying to get them to admit they were stupid, or trying to get them to admit that it was their mistake, don't ask those questions. It'll get a bit messy. It's not a good experience for the employee, and it can create kind of legal liability for you down the line. Cool. Like I said, many more questions, but we are at 2:18 and I have to jump into another meeting, unfortunately. I could be here all day doing this. This is my favorite thing to do. So to everyone who's joined, kia ora, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. I trust that you got something useful, you got a refresh out of the situation, out of the session, sorry, or at least some questions answered. Again, the slides and the recording, the bonus resources, including a link to book time with me if you like, will come around in an email afterwards. Otherwise, thank you so much. It was lovely to be with you here today, and we had some great engagement. So thank you again for all of your questions. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and I look forward to speaking with you next time. Kia ora, everyone.